Against the FNL terrorism. So when we hear the word terrorism, we understand very broadly what terrorism. We've all seen on the news 9/11, the 7/7 bombings. Terrorism as an act is to the clues in the name. It is to terrorise the people into thinking the same way. So for instance, for Guy Fawkes, he was classed as a terrorist. He was going to blow up Parliament in early times. When he was caught out, him and the other terrorists that was supposedly been, they was tortured for information. That's how they rounded up the rest of the co-conspirators from Guy Fawkes, was his confessions through the fact that he was a terrorist. So torture and terrorism go hand in hand quite a lot throughout history, and unfortunately it even does that to modern day now. As we will see later on in the presentation, through the American forces in Iraq. But for now, this was therefore a classic colonial war of liberation, and it is on these different viewpoints, police action versus war, that much of the argument about these events tends to unfold. In Algeria, there appears to be at least isolated incidents of torture even before 1954. So in 1954, when the Algerians revolted against the French, they wanted Algeria back. They didn't want to be a colony of France anymore. They've seen the devastation of the Second World War. They're sort of booming themselves. They don't want to be paying off all their money that they're doing to France. They want to turn around and say, this is our country now. The end of the colonial period's over. We've all got our own landmass. We've all got our own borders. Leave us alone. But the French didn't. The French sent troops in there to suppress the revolt, as they called it, and they used acts of torture quite often, and it was quite publicly known afterwards that they'd used torture to extract information from Algerians about where their leaders was, where their weapon caches was, what their plans was. Was they going to revolt in this city? Was they going to attack infrastructure, attack French supply lines? All these things was done with the result of torture. And this was in the modern times. But there we go even further forwards into the war into Iraq. And we come to what a lot of people may well know is the Abu Ghraib prison. Now, when we invaded Iraq in 1991 to defeat Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait, they took a lot of Iraqi prisoners that was part of Saddam's regime, and they ended up in black hole sites. They ended up in sites like Abu Ghraib. Now, the reason they did this for, the Americans claimed, was because they were trying to have priority information targets from these prisoners. They're trying to extract information out to turn around and find out where Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction were, which is what they claimed to go into Iraq for in the first place. We now know afterwards that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was just an ultimate lie. But they used we will call it torture through this presentation because it was, without a shadow of a doubt, it was torture, what they did. They didn't turn round and speak nicely, or they didn't turn around and just give them a couple of beatings. It was systematical torture, our Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib prison was used by United States personnel to degrade, humiliate prisoners, and even torture them. Washington DC, in which almost anything was permitted, provided that it was deemed necessary to serve the war on terror that was being waged by the United States. The CIA didn't like the word torture, but instead detention interrogation program using enhanced interrogation techniques. A prisoner there, Abu Zaballah, was placed in a box with restricted movement, as it was known he was claustrophobic. This, in fact, was that one act against Abu Zaballah was approved by W. Bush himself. Now, this is the President of the United States of America, a country that finds itself very proud. Its roots are there, fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy. Ever since the day of independence, they've always been one for liberty and freedom. So why is it when it comes to the war on terror, the lines get blurred about what's morally right and what's morally wrong? And that's the big issue with now fighting the war on terror. It's knowing what's morally right and morally wrong, and the lines get very blurred. And for the Americans, not only do the lines get blurred, but they way overstep it anyway for what they're intending to do. In November 2002, a suspected Afghanistan militant, Gul Rahman, died of hypothermia in a CIA black site north of Kabul, which is known as Salt Pit. Salt Pit was another black site like Abu Ghraib, where they had higher priority targets, and they tortured them. They tortured them for no reason whatsoever. But some of the interrogators may have believed that they was getting the right information, but the American government, the American Secret Service, they knew full damn well that there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They know for a fact they did. They have satellites. They have all this technology that the Iraqis couldn't combat. They would have found the Scud missiles, which is what they was claiming. They knew there were Scud missiles there. So why was there no evidence of them? And the way they tried to get evidence to justify this war was through the acts of torture under the guise of, well, we're fighting terrorism. Abu Zubaydah, who was bin Laden's lieutenant and was waterboarded 83 times. 83 times. 83 times. So, waterboarding, for those who don't know, is you're strapped down, you have a cloth or something placed over your mouth and water poured over. So, it's to reenact drowning. So, this bloke experienced the sensation of drowning to near death, 83 times. Now, I know for a fact myself, I would have lasted less than once, because there's no way that I would have been able to deal with the sensation of drowning over and over and over again. But it does make you think, if he was waterboarded 83 times, then he probably, well, almost certainly, does not know the information you're claiming that you're trying to seek out. He can't do, because you're not going to last that long. But the brainchild of 9/11 attacks, he was waterboarded 183 times. If he used to do that once a day, he was waterboarded. He had the simulation and felt like he was drowning every day for 6 months. 6 months of every day and felt like you're going to die and drown is just horrific, really. And for the reasons that they did it for the war on terror, I understand, it was terrible. The Americans want to find out this information. They want to find these people. But there's no need to go to the resorts like that, what they did do. Abu Ghraib shows that barbaric behaviour needs little encouragement to flourish when it suits the perpetrator. Especially when it comes to the war on terror. It doesn't need any encouragement, because the initial anger was in there for the American personnel. They'd gone to war, 9/11 had happened. They were very angry, they wanted revenge. And when people want revenge and they're not thinking methodically, that's when this sort of barbaric behaviour is very easy. And it can come out in the guise of, we're doing it for it's the wrong thing for the right reasons. And it's not. It's the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. It's just plain and simple revenge. And against a lot of people that didn't do anything wrong, or they were just simple soldiers that were just following orders. Eric Fair was an interrogator at the Abu Ghraib, and this is his statement about it. We hurt people, and not just physically. We destroyed them, and we destroyed them emotionally. And I think, at the very least, it's just punishment for us that we suffer some of those consequences too. But why didn't he speak out at the time? His answer to that is, I think the natural and fair question is, why I didn't say something or why I didn't quit. As a contractor, I could have quit at any point, but again, the desire had sort of been drilled into me to stay committed to things in the United States Army. These were my comrades. Whether they were contractors or whether they were soldiers, I knew the uniforms, I knew the ranks. At least at that point, I still supported the invasion and the war effort. So I felt that I had an obligation to be a part of it. there was a recognition that certainly war was going to be ugly, and I think I did my best to justify what was going on. So as we were saying, they were angry, they wanted revenge. He supported in his country, he believed in what this country was doing was right. So he also committed these acts of torture upon these Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib under the guise of, well, war's ugly, but we're doing the right thing. But when Abu Ghraib, when the images got released of United States personnel torturing Abu Ghraib, the world lost it. The world, that was it. America, the land of the free, is doing these horrific acts behind closed doors. What? The world was very upset, and this is the American response to this. Worst of all, our nation that, to a degree unprecedented in human history, has sacrificed its blood and treasure to secure liberty and human rights around the world, now must try to convince the world that the horrific images on their TV screens and front pages are not the real America. They are what we are. They are. That's what they see is not who we are. Not the real America. That what they see is not who we are. Now that was Senator Susan M. Collins. She's a Republican maid, Senator Armed Services Committee here on the Abu Ghraib prison, and this was released the 7th of May 2004. So they know that it was wrong. They know the acts of torture are wrong. They know that the America has a name to uphold of, protecting liberty and freedom, but they still did it anyway. And in the United States Department, after the images was released, removed 17 soldiers and officers from active duty. 11 soldiers were charged with dereliction of duty, mismaltreatment, aggravated assault and battery. Between May 2004 and April 2006, these soldiers were court-martialed, convicted, sentenced to military prison, and dishonourably discharged from service. 2 soldiers found to have perpetrated many of the worst offences at the prison. Specialist Charles Griner and PFC Lindell, England, were subject to more severe charges and received harsher sentences. Granier was convicted of assault, battery, conspiracy, maltreatment of detainees, committing indecent acts and deliberate dereliction of duty. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and loss of rank and pay. England was convicted of conspiracy, maltreatment detainees and committing an indecent act and sentenced to just 3 years in prison for what they'd done. Now, this was my presentation on the acts of torture, in the barbarization of warfare. Just to recap over it, torture's been around for a very long time to extract means. In more modern times, we like to believe ourselves to be morally better than what we try and say. But unfortunately, when it comes to warfare, torture follows hand in hand. Because there's always, seemingly by the perpetrators, some reason why they have to torture someone. They need to find out the secret weapons that's going to cause a lot of harm. The war on terror to torture people. To just gain vital information to give your side the upper hand. Wherever warfare is, torture is there, and torture is what turns warfare barbaric. Thank you for watching. My bibliography is there on the last screen. There we go. Hello guys, my name's Jack Pearson. Today I'm going to do a presentation on the subject of torture within the barbarisation of warfare module. Student number is 17 25 34 6, and this is my presentation. So the big question is, what actually is torture? We've all seen what you think torture is, but why? And on my presentation here, I've got the explanation. Torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person or any other reason based on discrimination of any kind. when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquaintance of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity, it does not include pain and suffering arising only from inherent in or accidental to lawful sanctions. Torture may come in many forms, more being severe than the others. So, a quick breakdown to that is torture basically means that you want to get information out of somebody as an official, you may be a public official, military official, government official, some form of official standing. You want to turn around and get information from somebody, but if they're not revealing the information, or there's somebody that's suspected with information, if they're not revealing them, then torture was used all the way from the very early ages by inflicting pain onto the others. So the pain is so severe that you'll get in the hope that you'll get the information out that you want. But a lot of times when people were suspected of stuff that they hadn't done, they're very quickly going to admit to stuff that they haven't done. They've got no idea from, just purely from the pain that they went through. The first records of the use of torture was all the way back in the 21st century BC, and that was to prove the guilt of Ur-Nammu in the Sumerian Code and the Babylon Code of Hammurabi, in which the inventory procedure employed the so-called divine judgment of the water ordeal. These divine judgments would become normal in society to prove innocence or guilt, and has remained well into the 18th century. As you may well know, during the Salem witch trials and stuff like that, torture was used quite a lot to gain confessions out of the accused. These women also would be subjected to the water ordeal and other various forms of torture to gain the information that the inquisitors at the time would have wanted. And the reason what they would have wanted to hear is, yes, you was a witch. Yes, we was right in accusing you. There you go. We're going to sentence you to death lawfully, and everybody will agree because you have confessed. But the only reason you've confessed is because you've been put through such an ordeal. The use of torture spun completely out of control in the campaign of the Inquisition against heresy, which is what we was just mentioning now. Cases of witchcraft and political crimes became the principal means to extort confession. The records of trials conducted throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th century testify to the numerous tragic verdicts reached out on the basis of confessions extorted by excruciating methods of torture. So, like we was just saying, these people would have been accused, and then they'd have had torture inflicted upon them to get the confessions to what the inquisitors want. Right, so if we look more into modern times about the uses of torture, I mean, we can always look through history and go, well, 500 years ago, the world was a completely different place. Every value that we hold near and dear to us now as human beings wasn't really about 500 years ago. The world was completely different. It operated different. The morals, the very basic human morals, was very different. Very different 500 years ago than what it was to now. So if we move forward now to more recent times, especially times of warfare in the 19th, 20th and 21st century, we find uses of torture where us as people we wouldn't expect to see torture. Torture's the sort of thing that you hear about and talk about when people have turned around and done it 500 years ago. For instance, like the Terror of London, Guy Fawkes, the Inquisitors for the witchcraft, the Salem trials, all these things, and also warfare as well throughout the ancient ages. It wouldn't have been uncommon for captured soldiers to be tortured to reveal the location of the enemy units, to reveal where the king was hiding his treasure, or all sorts of reasons. But torture was a very go-to method to quickly extract information from suspected prisoners. Whereas nowadays we look at it and it was a terrible what happened, But we'd like to think that we don't do that anymore. But unfortunately, wherever there's warfare, it tends to be torture follows, because warfare is only one step away from torture, as we'll go through the presentation. So in the 1950s, the French went into an unofficial war with the Algerians. The French state itself refused to see the colonial conflict as a war, as that would recognise the other party, the National Liberation Front, or FLN, as a legitimate entity. Thus, until the 10th of August 1999, the French Republic persisted in calling the Algerian War a simple operation of public order. It was, to the French, it was, right, well, they're not a real enemy, they're not a real army, so they can't be classed as an army or an enemy. So what it is it's the people revolting, it's a public dispute, it's nothing serious. The French persisted in calling the Algerian War a simple operation of public order against the FNL, terrorism. Now, when we reach the word terrorism, we have a very clear understanding of terrorism.